The air in the Grand Hall of the International Historical Congress was thick, not merely with the scent of old paper and polished wood, but with an almost palpable tension. Every eye, from the most junior doctoral candidate to the most esteemed tenured professor, was fixed on the lone figure bathed in the harsh glow of the projector, Dr. Eris Thorne. He stood before a colossal, high-definition image of the legendary monarch Solara, whose benevolent, unwavering gaze had graced countless textbooks and national monuments for centuries. Thorne, a man known more for his quiet, almost monastic dedication to forgotten archives than for public spectacle, was presenting what he calmly described as a re-evaluation of optical nuance. The words sounded innocuous, academic even, yet the ripple of unease that had already begun to spread through the audience suggested something far more incendiary was at play. Thorne, with his spectacles perched low on his nose and a slight tremor in his usually steady voice, pointed a laser at Solara's portrait. Specifically, he pointed to the monarch's left eye. He spoke of minute variations in brushstroke, of light refraction, of a subtle, almost imperceptible deviation in the angle of the iris. Details so infinitesimally small they required advanced digital microscopy and historical cross-referencing to even detect, let alone interpret. This tiny overlooked detail, he argued, was not an artist's error, nor a trick of light, but a deliberate coded message from the past. A message, he posited, that had been staring back at history for generations, patiently awaiting discovery. Before he could elaborate further, a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the hushed anticipation. Professor Evelyn Reed, a titan of classical historical interpretation and the chair of the academic panel, rose from her seat, her face a mask of barely contained fury. Her silver hair, usually meticulously coiffed, seemed to bristle with indignation. "Dr. Thorne," she began, her voice resonating with an unyielding certainty that brooked no argument, "are you truly suggesting that centuries of meticulous scholarship, the foundational bedrock of our understanding of Solara's reign, could be overturned by what appears to be nothing more than an artistic anomaly, a speck of dust on a canvas, or perhaps a trick of your rather overactive imagination?" Her words were a public disembowelment, a theatrical dismissal designed to crush not just Thorne's findings, but his very credibility. The murmurs in the hall intensified, a mix of shock, agreement, and nervous anticipation. Professor Reed continued, her voice rising in pitch and volume, "This is not groundbreaking research. It is speculative fiction, bordering on historical libel. To suggest such a thing without irrefutable contextual evidence is not only irresponsible, it is damaging to the very integrity of our discipline." Her pronouncements were met with nods from several members of the panel, their expressions reflecting a mixture of concern and outright disdain. They saw Thorne's work as a dangerous crack in the edifice of established truth, a threat to the very narratives they had spent their careers defending and propagating. The pressure in the room became almost unbearable, a tangible weight pressing down on Thorne. Yet, to the surprise of many, he did not falter. His gaze, usually unassuming, met Professor Reed's fiery challenge with an unnerving calm. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips, a subtle defiance that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. He simply adjusted his glasses, took a slow, deliberate breath, and waited for the storm to subside. This composure, this quiet conviction in the face of such a fierce public onslaught, was perhaps more unsettling than any of his controversial claims. It was the calm before a tsunami, a silent acknowledgement that the forces opposing him fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the revelation he was about to unleash. For what Thorne had uncovered, what lay hidden within that monarch's seemingly benign stare, was more than just a footnote. It was a whisper, a seismic tremor that threatened to unravel the very fabric of accepted history. The initial consequence was a mere ripple, the uncomfortable suggestion that everything they thought they knew about Solara, about an entire era, might be fundamentally flawed. But the full, devastating impact, the true scale of the historical earthquake, remained shrouded, tantalizingly out of reach, waiting to erupt. History, it seemed, had been watching them all along, patiently holding its breath. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The hushed murmurs of the present day, still echoing with the audacity of Dr. Eris Thorne's revelation, faded into the distant past, carrying us back to the quiet rhythm of his existence before the storm. It was a life steeped in the aroma of aged paper and the silent companionship of forgotten voices, played out within the ancient stone walls of a university town that time seemed to have overlooked. Here, the cobblestone streets absorbed the hurried footsteps of students and scholars alike, while the libraries, with their towering shelves and hushed alcoves, stood as bastions of knowledge, both revered and, at times, stubbornly unyielding. Thorne himself was a creature of habit, his days meticulously structured around the pursuit of historical truth. He rose with the first light, a mug of steaming black coffee his only immediate companion, before retreating to his study, a sanctuary overflowing with books, maps, and an intricate web of research notes that would appear chaotic to an outsider but were, to him, a perfectly ordered universe of inquiry. His research was not driven by ambition for accolades, but by an insatiable, almost spiritual hunger for accuracy, for the authentic whisper of history that often lay buried beneath layers of interpretation and convenient narrative. He spent countless hours poring over original documents, deciphering faded script, cross-referencing minor details, his gaze always searching for the overlooked, the anomaly that might just be the key to unlocking a deeper understanding. The university, ancient and venerable, provided the ideal backdrop for such an intense scholarly life, yet its very age also bred a certain rigidity, a reverence for tradition that sometimes bordered on outright resistance to any radical reevaluation. Within this cloistered world, Thorne maintained a small, trusted circle of colleagues, fellow historians and archivists who shared his quiet dedication, though perhaps not always his daring intellectual spirit. Dr. Lena Petrova, a brilliant linguist with an uncanny ability to translate obscure dialects, and Professor Alastair Finch, a meticulous genealogist, were his most frequent collaborators, their shared passion for the past forming a silent camaraderie. They understood his quiet intensity, his tendency to disappear into the depths of a research rabbit hole for days on end, emerging only with a new hypothesis or a fragment of a forgotten truth. Thorne, though reserved, found solace in their shared intellectual curiosity, a rare comfort in a world increasingly dominated by academic politics and the pursuit of grants. The broader academic culture, however, was a different beast entirely. It was a hierarchical landscape, meticulously structured around established methodologies and the veneration of foundational figures. To challenge a long-accepted interpretation, especially one concerning a revered monarch or a pivotal historical event, was not merely an academic exercise. It was often perceived as an attack on the very integrity of the discipline, a dangerous flirtation with revisionism. Tenure, funding, and reputation were often tied to the defense of the status quo, creating an environment where radical new interpretations, no matter how rigorously supported, were met with skepticism, if not outright hostility. This institutional inertia weighed heavily on Thorne, even before he stumbled upon the truly explosive detail within the monarch's portrait. He was a quiet observer, deeply passionate about the nuanced truth, yet acutely aware of the formidable barriers erected by generations of entrenched thought. He had seen promising young scholars, brimming with innovative ideas, gradually worn down by the system, their enthusiasm dulled by endless peer reviews, dismissive panel discussions, and the unspoken pressure to conform. He understood the immense personal cost of challenging the giants of history, of daring to suggest that what everyone believed to be true might, in fact, be a carefully constructed illusion. It was within this rigid framework that the initial, subtle tensions with Professor Evelyn Reed had first begun to manifest. Reed, a formidable figure in the field of monarchical studies, embodied the very essence of the traditionalist establishment. Her reputation was built on decades of meticulously defending the accepted narrative, her published works forming the bedrock of many university curricula. She viewed Thorne's more unorthodox, interdisciplinary approach with a thinly veiled disdain, often dismissing his earlier, less controversial papers as unnecessarily speculative or lacking in proper historical gravitas during departmental seminars. These were not open confrontations, but rather a series of subtle slights, dismissive comments, and pointed silences that spoke volumes. Thorne recalled a particular instance years ago when he had presented preliminary findings on a minor artistic anomaly in a different royal tapestry, suggesting it might hint at a forgotten court artisan. Professor Reed had merely sniffed. An interesting flight of fancy, Dr. Thorne, but hardly a matter of historical import. We deal in facts, not artistic whimsy. Her words, delivered with an air of unassailable authority, had stung, not just for their dismissiveness, but for their deliberate undermining of his methodology. Such exchanges, seemingly minor at the time, had accumulated over the years, creating a quiet chasm between Thorne's meticulous, truth-seeking approach and Reed's staunch defense of established narratives. She viewed his independent thinking as a potential threat to the intellectual order she so carefully maintained, while he saw her as a gatekeeper, more concerned with preserving a comfortable past than with uncovering its profound complexities. These early tensions, though never escalating to outright conflict, laid a fragile, almost invisible foundation for the seismic clash that would inevitably erupt when Thorne finally dared to present the full, devastating implications of the gaze. He knew with a quiet certainty that the historical narrative he was about to confront was not just a collection of facts, but a deeply ingrained cultural reality, fiercely protected by those who had built their careers upon its unquestioned truths. The quiet observer was preparing to challenge a world that preferred its history, neat, predictable, and utterly undisturbed. Dr. Aris Thorne's unwavering composure, that unsettling calm he displayed under Professor Reed's scathing attacks, was not born of indifference or arrogance. It was a cultivated shield, forged over generations within his family, a legacy of intellectual fortitude passed down like an heirloom, polished by the friction of academic resistance. The Thornes had always been seekers of inconvenient truths, a lineage of scholars who understood the immense, often painful, cost of challenging the accepted narrative, who saw history not as a static monument but a dynamic, often deliberately obscured, landscape. His grandfather, Elias Thorne, a brilliant but ultimately marginalized classicist, had spent his twilight years fighting for the reinterpretation of obscure Roman texts, convinced they held keys to a forgotten political upheaval that reshaped an empire. Elias's theories, though eventually proven partially correct decades after his death, were met with vitriol and professional ruin in his own time. Aris had grown up with the echoes of that struggle, the quiet dignity with which his grandfather bore the academic ostracism, the unwavering belief in the truth even when it stood alone against a chorus of dismissive voices. This familial history wasn't a burden, it was a blueprint for resilience, teaching Aris that the pursuit of genuine insight often meant walking a solitary, scorned path. He had learned early that academic validation was fleeting, but truth, once unearthed, was eternal. This deep-seated respect for challenging the status quo, inherited from his forebears, placed Aris in direct philosophical opposition to the prevailing academic currents, particularly those championed by Professor Evelyn Reed. Reed represented the bastion of traditionalism, a school of thought that prioritized stability, established consensus, and the preservation of revered historical narratives above all else. Her approach, meticulous and rigorous within its own confines, was inherently cautious, viewing any radical reinterpretation as a dangerous destabilization of collective memory. For Reed, history was a carefully constructed edifice, and Thorne, with his propensity for unsettling questions, was perceived as an intellectual vandal, chipping away at its foundations. The cracks in the accepted narrative, and in Thorne's relationship with the academic establishment, began long before the monarch's portrait became his singular focus. One particularly vivid memory from his early career involved a paper he submitted to a prestigious historical journal, detailing a nuanced reevaluation of a minor economic policy from the late medieval period. He had argued with compelling if unorthodox evidence that the policy, long celebrated as a stroke of genius, was in fact a desperate measure that inadvertently sowed the seeds of future rebellion. The paper was not merely rejected, it was returned with a curt, almost disdainful note from the anonymous peer reviewer, later revealed to be Professor Reed herself, stating that his speculative conclusions undermined decades of sound scholarship and that his methodology was dangerously revisionist. The sting of that dismissal lingered, not because of the rejection itself, but because it highlighted the deep-seated resistance to anything that dared to deviate from the sanctioned view. Another instance, a more subtle but equally impactful slight, occurred at a regional history conference. Aris, then a young lecturer, presented a preliminary analysis of a series of overlooked architectural features in a provincial castle, suggesting they implied a different military purpose than previously assumed. During the Q&A session, Professor Reed, then already a luminary, had publicly scoffed, remarking that some historians mistake imagination for insight, leading them down fanciful rabbit holes rather than into the corridors of verifiable fact. The room had chuckled, and Aris felt a flush of humiliation, even as a quiet voice within him reaffirmed the validity of his observations. These were not isolated incidents. They were threads in a growing tapestry of academic marginalization, each thread reinforcing the chasm between his exploratory, questioning approach and the rigid defensive posture of the establishment. He remembered the hushed conversations among his few trusted colleagues after such encounters, the shared frustration over the stifling atmosphere that rewarded conformity and punished intellectual bravery. They spoke of the old guard, a term whispered with a mixture of reverence and resentment, referring to figures like Reed, who held immense sway over funding, publication, and tenure. Thorne, however, never allowed these slights to fester into bitterness. Instead, they sharpened his resolve, refining his methods, pushing him to seek out evidence so irrefutable that it could withstand even the most entrenched opposition. He understood that his grandfather's generation had lacked the tools to definitively prove their challenging theories, leaving them vulnerable to dismissal. Aris was determined that his own work would leave no such gaps, no room for the easy repudiation he had witnessed and experienced. The very act of meticulously poring over primary sources, seeking out the peripheral details, the anomalies, the things others dismissed as artistic flourishes or minor errors, became his sanctuary and his weapon. He knew that the grand narratives, the sweeping pronouncements of history, were often built upon layers of interpretation, some of which, over centuries, had hardened into unquestionable truth. But beneath these layers, he believed, lay the granular, often contradictory realities. His unorthodox approach, derided by Reed and her ilk, was simply an extension of his family's enduring quest to peel back those layers, to listen to the whispers of the past that the dominant narrative had silenced. The portrait's gaze, in a sense, was merely the next, most profound whisper he was destined to hear, a detail that would finally give voice to his long-held conviction that history was far more intricate, far more human, and far more revolutionary than anyone had dared to admit. He was ready to face the storm, for the quiet understanding of the personal cost had been instilled in him since childhood, a price he was willing to pay for the sake of truth. The quiet understanding of the personal cost had been instilled in him since childhood, a price he was willing to pay for the sake of truth. This conviction, however, did not spare him the insidious erosion of spirit that came with persistent academic dismissal. Over the years, the slights had evolved from mere public rebukes to a more subtle, yet equally damaging, campaign of professional marginalization. There were the broken promises, like the time a prestigious research grant, for which Aris had meticulously prepared a compelling proposal, was inexplicably redirected at the last minute to a less experienced colleague, whose project conveniently aligned with Professor Reed's current research interests. The official explanation cited strategic realignment of departmental priorities, a phrase that tasted like ash in Aris's mouth, but he knew the unspoken truth. It was a deliberate move to starve his more unconventional inquiries of vital resources. Publication opportunities, too, became increasingly scarce. Papers that had previously garnered enthusiastic peer reviews suddenly faced inexplicable delays in editorial processes or were met with a barrage of night-picking critiques that felt less like constructive feedback and more like calculated attempts to exhaust his resolve. One particularly painful memory involved a symposium on Renaissance art where Aris, having been invited to present, found his slot mysteriously moved to a less prominent time, sandwiched between two highly technical, niche presentations, ensuring a minimal audience. During the sparse Q&A, the silence that followed his presentation was deafening, a palpable void punctuated only by the rustle of papers from a few senior academics who pointedly avoided eye contact, their indifference a colder, sharper weapon than any direct criticism. These were not isolated incidents of bad luck or academic rigor. They were part of a pattern, a slow, deliberate tightening of the noose. The subtle emotional aggressions were perhaps the most insidious. In departmental meetings, when Aris presented a nascent theory or a preliminary finding, Professor Reed would often interject with a dismissive cough or a pointed, almost imperceptible shake of her head, enough to signal to others that his ideas were not to be taken seriously. Other senior colleagues, observing this dynamic, would then adopt similar tactics, offering backhanded compliments or feigning confusion regarding his perfectly clear arguments. Dr. Thorne, "Your passion is admirable," one would say, "but perhaps we should focus on what is empirically verifiable rather than what feels intuitive." The implication was clear. His work lacked the gravitas of true scholarship. Manipulative behaviors became more pronounced as his reputation for independent thought grew. He found himself excluded from informal academic networks, the very places where collaborations were forged and ideas freely exchanged. Invitations to exclusive seminars or dinner parties, once regular, ceased altogether. He remembered overhearing a conversation where a junior colleague was subtly discouraged from collaborating with him, warned that aligning with Aris's unorthodox approach might jeopardize their own career progression. The message was unmistakable: fall in line or face professional isolation. This continuous emotional corrosion began to take its toll, deepening the furrows in his brow, adding a new quietness to his already reserved demeanor. He spent more time in the archives, more time lost in the silent company of ancient texts and forgotten documents, finding solace in the unwavering truth of the past rather than the shifting sands of present-day academic politics. Yet, this growing isolation did not break him. Instead, it forged a quiet determination, hardening his resolve like steel. Each slight, each dismissed idea, each broken promise only reinforced his conviction that he was on the right path, that the truth he sought lay precisely where the establishment refused to look. It was during this period of intense, solitary research that the gaze first appeared to him, not as a revelation, but as a fleeting, intriguing anomaly. He was examining a high-resolution digital scan of the monarch's portrait, cross-referencing it with a lesser-known contemporary engraving. The subtle misalignment, the almost imperceptible deviation in the subject's eyes, was so minor that most art historians dismissed it as a stylistic variation, a common artistic liberty, or even a minor error in the original painting that was corrected in subsequent copies. For years, it had remained a nagging thought, a tiny burr under the saddle of his subconscious. He'd seen it in various reproductions, noted it in his meticulous research journals as gaze anomaly, investigate further, but it was always overshadowed by more pressing, more conventional research questions. Others, when he casually mentioned it, would wave it away. An interesting observation, Aris, but hardly significant. Professor Reed herself had remarked during a brief, forced conversation years ago. Artists often took liberties, we must not project modern psychological analyses onto historical portraiture. Her words were a dismissal, a subtle emotional aggression masquerading as scholarly advice. Yet, the detail persisted in the periphery of Eris's mind, an unresolved chord in the symphony of historical data hinting at a deeper resonance. It was more than just an artistic quirk. It felt deliberate, almost coded. He began to notice similar subtle, almost subliminal details in other related works from the period, each one too minor to be considered truly significant on its own, but together forming a faint, recurring pattern. The gaze, in particular, held a unique quality. It was not merely looking away, it was looking at something specific, something just outside the frame of the painting, yet undeniably within the world it depicted. This faint, intriguing anomaly, dismissed by everyone else as inconsequential, became a quiet obsession for Thorne, a persistent whisper from the past that refused to be silenced. His growing isolation only deepened his focus, allowing him to delve into the minutiae that others overlooked, driven by an unshakable belief that the most profound truths often hid in plain sight, waiting for someone with the patience and courage to truly see them. The emotional toll of his academic battles had stripped away any desire for superficial acceptance, leaving him free to pursue the path less traveled, where the true history lay concealed. His determination, now tempered by years of quiet struggle, was ready to unlock the secret of that enigmatic gaze. The quiet understanding of the personal cost had been instilled in him since childhood, a price he was willing to pay for the sake of truth. This unwavering resolve, however, did not shield him from the storm that began to gather, slowly at first, then with increasing intensity, as his focus on the monarch's portrait deepened. What had once been academic disagreements, confined to the polite skirmishes of footnotes and peer reviews, now began to spill over, tainting professional relationships and personal interactions. The discussions in departmental seminars, which previously held an air of detached intellectual inquiry, transformed into heated arguments, often veering away from the factual merits of his burgeoning research and instead targeting his methodology, his integrity, and even his perceived motives. Professor Reed, ever the formidable presence, became the focal point of this opposition. Her critiques grew sharper, her dismissals more public and pointed. She began to frame his work not merely as mistaken, but as irresponsible, a dangerous flirtation with historical revisionism that threatened the very foundations of their discipline. "Dr. Thorne," she would declare at departmental meetings, her voice cutting through the air, "seems intent on dismantling narratives without first demonstrating a solid framework for reconstruction. This is not scholarship, it is iconoclasm for its own sake." Her words, once mere academic posturing, now carried a venomous edge designed to isolate and discredit. Other senior colleagues, once neutral or even mildly supportive, began to echo her sentiments, their voices forming a chorus of disapproval that grew louder with each passing week. The escalation wasn't confined to formal academic settings. It seeped into the social fabric of the university town, a place where intellectual reputation often dictated social standing. Thorne found himself subtly yet unmistakably ostracized. Invitations to informal gatherings, once regular occurrences, ceased entirely. Conversations would abruptly halt when he approached, or shift to innocuous topics, the underlying tension palpable. Whispers followed him down the hallowed corridors, murmurs about his unconventional and radical interpretations, painting him as an eccentric, perhaps even a pariah. Some colleagues, catching his eye in the library, would offer a fleeting, almost apologetic nod, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken pressure to distance themselves from his burgeoning controversy. The sense of isolation grew, a heavy, suffocating blanket that threatened to smother his intellectual fire. The psychological environment became a relentless crucible for Thorne. Each day brought a new challenge, a fresh slight, a subtle act of exclusion that chipped away at his composure. The weight of potentially challenging an entire historical paradigm, a narrative woven into the very identity of a nation, pressed down on him with immense force. He understood with chilling clarity that the stakes were no longer confined to academic accolades or professional advancement. His reputation, his career, and perhaps even his peace of mind hung in the balance. He was not merely correcting a detail, he was confronting a deeply entrenched truth, one that had been accepted for centuries, shaping cultural identity and political legitimacy. The personal cost he had quietly acknowledged now began to manifest in tangible ways, in the sleepless nights spent wrestling with data, in the gnawing anxiety that accompanied every public appearance, in the increasing loneliness that permeated his existence. Yet, paradoxically, this mounting pressure only intensified his focus on the monarch's gaze. What had begun as a curious anomaly, an intriguing deviation from artistic convention, now demanded his full, undivided attention. The subtle, almost imperceptible detail in the portrait, once a scholarly puzzle, transformed into a personal obsession, a beacon in the storm of academic hostility. He spent countless hours in the quiet solitude of his study, surrounded by reproductions, historical texts, and digital analyses, scrutinizing every brushstroke, every shadow, every minute shift in the subject's expression. He sensed, with an almost visceral certainty, that within that gaze lay not just an artistic peculiarity, but a profound implication, a hidden message waiting to be deciphered. The more he delved, the more he understood the magnitude of what he was uncovering. It wasn't just a minor historical correction, it was a potential earthquake, capable of shifting the very bedrock of established history. The gaze held a secret, a deliberate alteration that, if proven, would not merely rewrite a chapter, but an entire volume. He felt the immense responsibility of this discovery, the burden of truth weighing heavily on his shoulders. He knew that revealing it would not be met with quiet academic debate, but with an onslaught of fury, a desperate attempt by the old guard to protect the narratives they had built their careers upon. But the detail, once a whisper, now roared in his mind, demanding to be heard, demanding to be understood, demanding to be brought into the light, regardless of the personal cost. He was ready to face the full force of their outrage, for the truth, he now understood, was far more important than any career, any reputation, or any fragile peace. The gaze held the key, and he was destined to unlock it. The subtle slights and dismissive chuckles had, over time, calcified into something far more insidious. Professor Reed, perhaps sensing the growing weight of Thorne's quiet persistence, began to move beyond mere academic discourtesy. Her actions, once veiled in professional critique, now bore the sharp edge of ruthless intent. The first overt assault came disguised as bureaucratic red tape. Thorne's routine request for extended access to the Royal Archives, crucial for cross-referencing the increasingly complex iconography surrounding the monarch's portrait, was inexplicably denied. The official reason, oversubscription and resource limitations, rang hollow. Such refusal for a senior researcher was unprecedented, a thinly veiled attempt to starve his research of vital oxygen. This was no longer intellectual disagreement, but control, protecting a historical narrative Reed and her allies had spent careers upholding. The denial of archive access was quickly followed by a more public damaging maneuver. Articles began appearing in obscure respected academic journals, penned by Reed's protégé, and often co-signed by sympathetic senior scholars. These pieces, ostensibly reviewing established historical methodologies, contained thinly veiled critiques of speculative interpretations of minor artistic details, warning against revisiting foundational historical figures through a lens of unsubstantiated revisionism. They never mentioned Thorne by name, but the timing, language, and target of their veiled warnings were unmistakable. It was a preemptive strike, discrediting his anticipated findings before their public unveiling, poisoning scholarly opinion. The personal attacks, however, were the most difficult to stomach. Whispers, initially confined to faculty lounges, began to spread more widely, reaching university administrators. Rumors of Thorne's eccentricity morphed into suggestions of unprofessional conduct and even unstable mental states, implying his theories stemmed from a troubled mind, not rigorous inquiry. A meticulously prepared, peer-reviewed grant application was suddenly withdrawn, citing concerns about the researcher's focus. Thorne, a man who had always prided himself on his unwavering civility, felt a cold, hard anger begin to simmer beneath his calm exterior. The intellectual battle devolved into personal war, waged with reputation and professional sabotage. He remembered a particularly galling incident during a university senate meeting. Professor Reed, in a seemingly innocuous discussion about research ethics, had made a pointed, rhetorical remark about the moral obligation of historians not to sensationalize or invent narratives for personal gain, especially when dealing with revered historical figures. Her gaze had flickered directly to Thorne, a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment, but pregnant with malice. Thorne had felt the eyes of his colleagues on him, some sympathetic, most uncomfortable, and a few openly hostile. It was a calculated performance, designed to isolate him further, to paint him as an academic pariah. This relentless onslaught began to chip away at Thorne's last vestiges of patience and academic decorum. He had always believed in the power of reasoned argument, in the eventual triumph of truth through diligent scholarship, but the actions of Reed and her faction demonstrated a cynical disregard for those ideals. They weren't interested in debate, they were interested in suppression. The polite disagreements had curdled into outright hostility, and Thorne realized, with a profound sense of clarity, that the rules of engagement had irrevocably changed. The quiet observer, the meticulous researcher, was being pushed to a breaking point. He spent countless nights in his study, the portrait's enigmatic gaze illuminated by the soft glow of his desk lamp. The implications of what he had uncovered were no longer theoretical hypotheses. They were stark, undeniable truths screaming for recognition. He had meticulously cross-referenced his digital analyses with obscure genealogies, forgotten diplomatic correspondence, and even architectural schematics of the monarch's era, all confirming the unsettling narrative hidden within that subtle shift of the eye. The gaze was not merely a detail. It was a deliberate coded signal, a silent scream from the past, designed to be understood only by those who possess the keys to its intricate language. Thorne now held those keys. He understood the full, devastating scope of his discovery. It didn't just challenge a minor historical footnote. It fundamentally undermined the legitimacy of a foundational historical figure, potentially rewriting centuries of established history, impacting national identity, and shaking the very foundations of academic authority. The monarch, long revered as a paragon of virtue and stability, was, according to the silent testimony of the portrait, something entirely different. Thorne felt the immense weight of this impending revelation, a responsibility that both terrified and exhilarated him. The academic world, with its carefully constructed hierarchies and its rigid adherence to established narratives, was about to experience a seismic shock. Thorne knew that unleashing his findings would not be a gentle unveiling but an explosive detonation. He envisioned the fallout, the outrage, the desperate attempts by Reed and her allies to contain the truth. But he was ready. His civility, once a cornerstone of his professional persona, had been stretched and broken by their relentless, unethical attacks. The time for polite discourse was over. The time for irrefutable evidence, for a truth so potent it would shatter the fragile peace of the academic world, had arrived. He had absorbed their blows, endured their slights, and now, armed with a truth that transcended their petty politics, he was prepared to fight back, not with anger but with the unyielding force of history itself. The gaze had whispered its secrets to him, and he was finally prepared to shout them to the world. The air in the grand lecture hall was thick with attention that hummed with 1,000 unspoken challenges. Every seat was filled, not just by curious scholars, but by the entrenched guardians of history, their faces a mixture of skepticism, anticipation, and thinly veiled hostility. Professor Evelyn Reed sat in the front row, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the podium, a silent, formidable opponent. Dr. Eris Thorne, however, moved with a quiet, almost serene confidence as he approached the stage. The years of slights, the whispered dismissals, the overt attempts to discredit him, they had not broken his spirit but forged it into an unyielding resolve. This was not merely an academic presentation. It was a reckoning, a public unveiling of a truth so profound it would reverberate through the annals of time. He began not with a flourish, but with a calm, measured voice, projecting an authority that transcended the usual academic politeness. His introduction laid out the journey, the meticulous research, the inexplicable anomaly in the monarch's portrait that had haunted him for years. He spoke of the painting's historical significance, its revered place in national memory, setting the stage for the bombshell he was about to drop. The audience listened, some leaning forward, others crossing their arms, ready to dissect every word, every image. Thorne displayed high-resolution scans of the monarch's portrait, zooming in on the seemingly insignificant detail, the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the angle of the monarch's left eye, a deviation so minor it had been dismissed for centuries as artistic license or a mere trick of light. Then he unveiled his methodology, the culmination of years of tireless work. He projected complex overlays, demonstrating how newly developed digital analysis techniques, far beyond the capabilities of the human eye, had allowed him to isolate and magnify this minute detail. He showed how advanced algorithms, usually employed in forensic analysis, had meticulously mapped the precise vectors of the monarch's gaze, revealing an intentional, almost mathematical deviation from what was considered anatomically natural or artistically conventional for that era's portraiture. The room began to stir, a low murmur rippling through the rows, as the sheer precision of his data became undeniable. But the digital analysis was only the first layer. Thorne then presented a series of obscure historical texts, long relegated to dusty corners of forgotten archives which he had painstakingly cross-referenced. These were not mainstream chronicles, but personal letters, encrypted diplomatic communiques, and even coded annotations within royal household inventories, documents that spoke a different, clandestine language. He showed how specific phrases, symbols, and even seemingly random numerical sequences within these texts aligned with the precise angular deviation of the monarch's gaze. It was a complex, multi-layered puzzle, and Thorne, with a quiet brilliance, was assembling it piece by painstaking piece before their very eyes. He unveiled the mechanism of the coded message, the subtle alteration in the monarch's portrait gaze when viewed through the lens of this newly developed digital analysis, and cross-referenced with the obscure historical texts, revealed a hidden truth. The shift in the eye, he explained, was a deliberate, symbolic gesture, a visual key. When the angle of the gaze was translated into a specific numerical sequence, and that sequence was applied to a cipher found in one of the long-forgotten diplomatic letters, it unlocked a stunning revelation. The monarch, revered for generations as the legitimate heir, was in fact of a different, unacknowledged lineage, a lineage that, if known at the time, would have completely invalidated their claim to the throne and plunged the realm into unimaginable chaos. A collective gasp, sharp and visceral, tore through the lecture hall, quickly followed by a stunned silence that felt heavier than any roar. Faces went pale. Some scholars gripped the arms of their chairs. Others looked at Thorne with wide, disbelieving eyes. Professor Reed, for the first time, looked utterly shattered, her rigid composure crumbling into a mask of shock and dawning horror. The revelation was not merely academic, it was an earthquake beneath the foundations of history itself. The monarch's entire reign, their legacy, the very legitimacy of the dynasty they founded, was now not just questioned, but irrevocably undermined by the silent, coded message in their own portrait. This was the definitive turning point, a moment that shattered the carefully constructed narrative of centuries. The emotional trajectory of the story shifted violently, from the quiet struggle of an ostracized scholar to the explosive aftermath of an undeniable truth. The historical figure, long a symbol of stability and strength, was suddenly revealed to be a participant in a profound deception. their identity rewritten by a single deliberate detail in their painted eyes. The room was no longer a forum for academic debate. It was a crucible where the past was being violently remade, and Eris Thorne, the quiet historian, stood at its epicenter, holding the keys to a truth that would shake the world. He had not merely presented a paper, he had detonated a historical bomb. The gasp that rippled through the auditorium was not one of awe, but of profound disbelief, quickly followed by a cacophony of murmurs. Dr. Eris Thorne had just concluded his presentation, the final slide displaying the digitally enhanced image of the monarch's portrait. The subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the gaze, now starkly evident, juxtaposed with archival evidence that rendered its meaning undeniable. The room, moments before filled with the hushed tension of anticipation, erupted into a chaotic symphony of whispers, exclamations, and the frantic clicking of pens. Professor Evelyn Reed, her face a mask of scarlet fury, rose from her seat, her hand trembling as she pointed an accusatory finger at Thorne. But her words were lost in the swelling tide of bewildered astonishment that engulfed the assembly. Thorne stood at the podium, a strange calm settling over him amidst the storm. His body thrummed with exhaustion, the culmination of years of relentless research and the sheer audacity of his public challenge. Yet, beneath the weariness, a potent wave of vindication washed over him. He had spoken the truth, a truth that had been buried for centuries, whispered only by the silent canvas. He saw the myriad reactions etched on the faces before him, the outright outrage of the entrenched traditionalists, their expressions contorted by disbelief and a palpable sense of betrayal, the genuine intrigue of younger scholars, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension, and the subtle, almost imperceptible nods of a few elder colleagues who, having perhaps harbored their own quiet doubts, now felt a flicker of validation. The immediate aftermath was a maelstrom. The academic establishment, a behemoth of tradition and rigid hierarchy, reeled from the blow. Professor Reed, ever the vanguard of the old guard, launched a blistering counterattack, dismissing Thorne's evidence as an elaborate hoax, a cynical manipulation of data, and a reckless assault on historical integrity. Her voice, usually so authoritative, now carried a desperate edge, betraying the depth of her shock and fear. She mobilized her allies, a chorus of denunciation echoing through academic journals and closed-door meetings. They questioned Thorne's methodology, his motives, even his sanity, attempting to drown the inconvenient truth in a deluge of ad hominem attacks and scholarly derision. But the sheer weight of Thorne's meticulously presented evidence was too substantial to be easily dismissed. The digital analyses, cross-referenced with obscure diplomatic protocols, forgotten royal correspondence, and even the architectural blueprints of the royal palace, painted a narrative so coherent and compelling that even the most hardened skeptics found themselves grappling with uncomfortable questions. The subtle shift in the monarch's gaze, Thorne had demonstrated, was not an artistic flourish or a painter's error, but a deliberate coded signal, a silent commentary on the monarch's true lineage, a clandestine alliance, or perhaps even a carefully orchestrated deception regarding the succession. The implications were staggering, threatening to unravel not just a single monarch's legacy, but the very fabric of national identity built upon that legacy. News of the revelation spread like wildfire beyond the hallowed halls of academia. Media outlets, sensing the seismic shift, latched onto the story with voracious appetite. Headlines screamed about "History Rewritten," "The Gaze That Changed Everything," and "Monarch's Secret Unveiled." Public debate erupted, dividing opinion sharply. On one side were those captivated by the romantic notion of a hidden truth finally brought to light, eager to embrace a revised history, however unsettling. On the other, a vocal segment of the public, deeply invested in the traditional narrative, viewed Thorne's findings as an affront, a desecration of revered national symbols, and a dangerous destabilization of collective memory. Talk shows buzzed with impassioned arguments, social media platforms exploded with fervent discussions, and Thorne, once a reclusive scholar, found himself thrust into the uncomfortable glare of global scrutiny. Emotionally, Thorne navigated a treacherous landscape. The initial surge of vindication was soon tempered by a profound sense of fear. He had challenged powers far greater than he had fully comprehended, awakened a sleeping giant of historical inertia and national pride. The threats, both subtle and overt, began to filter in, not just from academic rivals, but from anonymous sources protective of the monarch's traditional image. Yet amidst the anxiety, a newfound sense of purpose solidified within him. He was no longer merely an academic seeking tenure or recognition. He was a disruptor, a catalyst. He had pulled back the curtain on a grand illusion, and there was no turning back. His responsibility now extended beyond the confines of his discipline, encompassing the public's right to an accurate understanding of its past. Professor Reed's initial furious resistance, though potent, began to show hairline fissures. While her public condemnations remained unwavering, the more objective members of her own faction, confronted with the sheer volume and robustness of Thorne's evidence, found themselves in a difficult position. Whispers of independent verification began to circulate as a few brave junior historians quietly initiated their own analyses, finding Thorne's conclusions increasingly difficult to refute. The united front of the traditionalists, once an impenetrable wall, started to crack under the relentless pressure of irrefutable fact. The gaze, once a subtle anomaly, had become a powerful truth, a silent witness demanding that the world finally listen. Thorne knew the battle was far from over, but the first, decisive shot had been fired, and the reverberations would echo for generations.